Good morning, everyone. We'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. Hope everyone had a good night. First on the agenda this morning is Dr. Matt Owen with a broadband internet update. Good morning, Dr. Owen.
Good morning, and thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, members. So my name again is Matt Owen, and my presentation today is in response to a request from Chairman Hazelwood, who asked staff to provide an update on the expansion of broadband coverage in Tennessee and the effect of tax incentives enacted to facilitate the expansion of coverage. You can find the supplementary materials for my presentation behind tab 7 in your docket books. So first, where are we today in terms of broadband coverage in Tennessee? The top line number, according to the latest data from the Federal Communications Commission, is 94%. That is 94% of residential locations in Tennessee are in areas where providers reported that they could provide either wired or fixed wireless service at speeds of at least 25 megabits per second download and 3 megabits per second upload as of June 30th, 2023. So if you turn your attention to Table 1 in Attachment A, we have provided a comparison of Tennessee to other states, and we've done that for two speed tiers, the 25.3 speed tier that I just mentioned, and at a faster speed tier, 100 megabits per second download and 20 megabits per second upload, and that faster speed tier aligns with the definition of underserved or the threshold for being underserved in some of the upcoming federal broadband grant rounds. We also have provided sort of two different subsets of that comparison. We looked at the wired and fixed wireless access together, and then we have a second comparison that looks only at wired access for those two speed tiers. So in terms of how Tennessee compares to other states, at that 25.3 speed tier and looking at wired and fixed wireless access combined, we rank 31st nationally, and I think we're third in the Southeast behind, I think it's Florida and South Carolina. But if you look at the faster speed tier, and especially if you look at the wired-only service, we actually rank a lot better. We're 15th nationally, I think, at the 100 megabits per second download speed tier for wired-only access. So that's actually pretty good. And returning to the question then, or back to the question of what can we say now about coverage expansion based on this? Well, unfortunately, the FCC data are not as helpful for that at the moment, and that is because the FCC has changed the way in the last few years that it assesses broadband coverage. And that means that we can't really compare the data that we used in our 2017 or 2021 broadband reports to the data that we have available to us today from the FCC. Those changes were intended to fix shortcomings in the FCC's prior approach to assessing broadband coverage, which were known to overstate the extent of coverage, though I will also say that there are questions about the accuracy of the new data, and that brings me to Table 2 in Attachment A. And that shows one of the things that I want to highlight about the FCC's new method, and that is that you can submit challenges about the accuracy of the data to the FCC. So just some background on how the FCC does things for its new process. It's the short version is that it's a two-step process. Step 1 is that the FCC, through a third-party vendor, creates a map of all residential and business locations. And then Step 2 is using that base map of locations, providers are asked to report for each location whether they can provide service, at what speed they can provide service, and what technology they use to provide that service. So you can actually challenge the accuracy of either of those two steps. You can challenge the accuracy of the base layer of locations, and you can also challenge the accuracy of the coverage that's reported. So what Table 2 is showing you is the cumulative number of challenges to the coverage layer that have been submitted since, I think it's November 2022, and that's by state. So comparing Tennessee to other states, we certainly haven't had the most number of challenges. We haven't had the least number either, and that holds true even if you adjust for population for states. But I think the bigger thing is that, not so much whether Tennessee is better, the data for Tennessee are better or worse than they are for any other state. but it's that there is now a process in place for the public to help improve the accuracy of the FCC data. And this is important because these data are used to determine eligibility for some of the federal programs. So now returning to what we can say about coverage expansion, if we can't use the FCC data for that right now, if that's not as helpful for us, what can we use? And what we found is that the data that are available from the Tennessee Department of Economic and Community Development's broadband grant programs show that Tennessee continues to make progress with broadband expansion. And so if you take a look at the table in attachment B, we put that together using the data that we got from ECD, and that shows totals for each of the broadband grant rounds that ECD has administered since fiscal year 2017-18. And we've also got both of the grant rounds. We've got the grant rounds that were state-funded grant rounds as well as the federally funded grant rounds. We've been able to break those out in the table with the help of ECD's staff. So the bottom line here from that is that since 2017-18, providers have committed to expand coverage to more than 179,000 locations in Tennessee in exchange for around $566 million in grants. And so far, the data show that around 98,500 of those previously unserved locations have now received broadband access as a result of the grants. And we'd expect that number to continue to increase in the coming years as some of our projects that are still in process get completed. Of course, this table is not showing you everything. It's not showing you some of the other federal programs that are not administered by ECD. So that includes some of the FCC's programs, that includes some of the programs from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And I also want to point out it's not showing any of the coverage expansions that broadband providers might have undertaken on their own. But what it does give a sense of is the forward momentum that we've built as a state when it comes to closing our remaining coverage gaps. And again, I'd expect that to continue both because of the projects that are in process and because in the next year or so, we'd anticipate another round of federally funded grants to be awarded. And this includes grants coming out of I think it's the roughly $813 million that have been set aside for broadband in Tennessee out of the Federal Infrastructure Act. And so you might hear that $813 million referred to as the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, or the BEAD program. So transitioning now to the second question as to what we can say about the effect of tax incentives on broadband expansion in Tennessee. The state has enacted 2 sales tax exemptions related to broadband in the last 5 years. We've got Public Chapter 501, Acts of 2019, and that exempts the cost of labor for installing fiber. We also have Public Chapter 1102, Acts of 2022, that's the Tennessee Broadband Investment Maximization Act. And that exemption covers several things. It covers the cost of equipment, machinery, other infrastructure, I think software and other things that are used to provide broadband. And it's time limited. It runs from July 1st of 2022 through June 30th of 2025. Unfortunately, we cannot assess the extent to which these exemptions have resulted in coverage expansion using existing state data. And that is because neither of these exemptions is conditioned on broadband providers expanding coverage. So as a result of that, there is no state agency that is monitoring whether the exemptions have resulted in coverage expansions or whether broadband providers are reinvesting the savings from these exemptions in Tennessee. Now, having said that, I would anticipate that some of these savings are being reinvested in Tennessee, but we will have to follow up with broadband providers to get a better sense of what that looks like. What I can tell you today, or what I can show you today, is in attachment C, and that gives you a sense of the total amount of sales that have been exempt as a result of Public Chapter 1102 so far. We got this data from the Department of Revenue. And so the top line of that table is what we received from revenue. That is the total amount of the exemptions by fiscal year for Chapter 1102. So in fiscal year 2022-23, that was roughly $125 million. And so far in fiscal year 2023-24, it's about $196 million. The bottom 2 rows on that table are TACIR staff estimates based on this data, and we tried to estimate the amount of sales tax avoided as a result of the exemption. Just one note on the local option sales tax row, that estimate is likely on the high end, and that is because of the single article cap on local option sales tax. I don't have the same type of information for you for Public Chapter 501, and that is because that exemption is not tracked separately, so it gets lumped together with a bunch of the other sales tax exemptions that taxpayers report on their filings with the department. And with that, I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank staff with the Department of Revenue and ECD for helping us with the data, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Any questions for Dr. Owen? Mayor Waters?
We have had a lot of difficulty extending broadband out in the county in our area, and that's because our utilities, our main utility chose not to participate in expanding it, and we're having to deal with Comcast and Charter and all of these other entities, and which makes expanding broadband much more complicated in my mind, because in a lot of areas the utilities are expanding, and we offered any grants we could get to turn over to our utility if they do that, and they chose not to. So it's made it much more difficult in my mind to expand broadband. And the problem is, and I was told this, and I'm asking if this is correct or not, that in determining who has the availability, number one, a lot of the wireless service is not reliable. Right? I'm told that in the county, but they lump that in, so to speak, as part of internet service or broadband is available to you if you have that wireless service provided. And I'm told that that's very unreliable service, and in a lot of areas of the county, people say either we can't get on it, or if we do get on it, it is so unreliable that we don't take it anymore. So that's one issue right there, is that they're saying 90-something% of the county has broadband, and I don't think that's correct. And the other issue is, part of that is they're using, I'm told, they're using census blocks to determine which census blocks have broadband available in them. And what I'm told is if one house in that census block has it available, they assume that every house in that whole census block has broadband available. And that's not the case in so many instances. I don't think. Is that one of the ways they determine whether you have broadband or not, by the census blocks?
So that's a great question, and that actually highlights the change that the FCC made. So prior to the new approach that they took, that's exactly how the FCC determined or made the determination of whether an area had coverage or not. They looked at the census block level, and if even one location in that census block was reported as being served, the FCC counted the entire block as being served. And so that did lead, that is exactly what led to the issue that you're describing, where the data had a tendency to potentially overstate the extent of coverage. And so that's one of the reasons why the FCC made the change to their new approach. My understanding is that they're not doing that anymore, that it's not at the census block level, it is done location by location. So hopefully that will improve in the coming years. As to your first question about the reliability of wireless, that's something that I'd have to do more research on for your specific area. I probably don't have a good answer for you for that.
And the issue becomes, I mean, the last ad I saw, they're saying that we have 90-something% coverage in the county, and that, to me, is just not accurate. I mean, we do not have that kind of coverage, in particularly in a lot of the rural areas, and so that reduces your ability to get these grants to provide that coverage. So we're sort of in a catch-22, or Senator Kohler used to say a catch-26. Yeah. He had always tell me, so that's a catch-26, and I know what's a catch-26. But anyway, it's just, it's becoming more complicated from my standpoint of trying to provide broadband in the county, because we don't have one server. We're trying to deal with 3 or 4 different entities to provide that, and it just, they'll go into an area if there's a lot of houses and it makes economic sense. But if there's not, and you've got to go to a sparse area to get to those houses, they don't want to do that because it doesn't make economic sense for them. We can't get grants because they're saying that these folks have broadband service, so it's a very challenging to try to get broadband out to these areas because of the way the system is set up. And I don't know that there's anything that can be done about it because, obviously they've set up this system and they're going to go with it, but it's just, I don't know if anybody else is having this challenge. I mean, if your utility's providing it, you've probably not got this, what I'm talking about, because they're out there. Utility has ability, electric system has the ability to provide it out there and get some of these grants and move forward and go into the areas that some of the private companies would not go into. But if you don't have a utility that provides it, it, in my mind, is making it much more difficult to provide that service. And I don't know if there's anything that we can do locally that you're aware of that might help us to get more money, get the availability of more money, and try to get the broadband service out to more areas.
The only thing I would recommend is to make use of the challenge process, and I know for the BEAD program, that upcoming federal funding round, the Tennessee Department of Economic and Community Development, under that program, is going to run even a separate additional challenge process for the data that they are using for that. So I can put you in touch with the broadband director at ECD to sort of get a better understanding of what that challenge process is going to look like. I think it's still in process. They have to get it approved by I think it's the National Technology and Information Administration, the federal entity that's overseeing the funding. But I'd be happy to put you in touch with ECD staff for that.
Okay, I appreciate that.
Okay, I'll do that.
Thank you.
Senator Yarborough.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And somewhat to follow up on that question, I mean, I think there's a difference between sort of technical access that is written into some of these government reports and when you have kind of real world access. I mean, what matters is whether you have, your citizens have access to the internet in a meaningful way. And I mean, I think that does the report, I mean, I think the report was trying to get to adoption too. Do we really get into the data on that in the report?
So we didn't dig into that in response to the request from Chairman Hazelwood, but I know we did look at that extensively in 2021 and in 2017.
Okay.
And there's actually a lot going on in the space of adoption right now in Tennessee. Our staff sit in part on I think it's the Digital Equity task force, I guess, that ECD has put together as part of their broadband programs. And so there's a lot going on in the state. And that is really very important.
Oh, I appreciate that. And I guess the reason I asked the question is that, I mean, I think that just the census data has like 20% of Tennessee's population not using the internet, 35% not using a PC or tablet, 13% in households that lack a subscription. And I mean, which, is bigger when you actually apply that to population, that's households. So, but, I mean, I guess the reason I ask it in the access format is that, do we have good data on whether that lack of adoption follows the lack of access as we, define it here?
That's a good question. I would have to do some more digging on that to see sort of what the overlap is there. I do know that some of the federal funding that's coming down is going to be set aside, I think, for digital equity, digital literacy purposes. So,
well, I appreciate it. I just, I mean, I think that, to the point, I don't want us to get, sort of into some esoteric race to get to 99%, to hit a government metric on technical access. If there's simpler and more cost-efficient ways that we could actually meaningfully improve how many people have real-world access to, participating in the modern economy.
Yeah, that's great. Yes.
Any other questions? Senator?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So it looked to me like there was a really big jump, actually, subsequent to the census and because of the funds that we had coming in. So almost half of what we've done was made up over the past few years. I mean, you know, we doubled that in the last 3 years, it looks like. My question is what, and you may not know the answer to this, and I don't expect you to because it's not within the scope of what you were doing, but if you happen to know, what is the ownership mix in terms of who got awarded these contracts?
Oh, for the grants?
Yeah.
So it is a mix. It's a mix between our existing for-profit internet service providers, some of our nonprofit internet service cooperatives, as well as municipal utilities. So there has been a mix around who's received funding. I don't have the exact breakdown off the top of my head, but that is something we could actually probably get back to you based on what we've received from ECD.
That'd be great. Yeah, if you happen to have that, I'd just love to know kind of what we're looking at, and that'd be great. Thanks.
Okay.
Any other questions? Yes, Mayor.
One more, and a follow-up to that, these private entities, I mean, they are applying for these grants on their own, I'm not exactly sure how a county government can interact with them other than talk with them as I have done and encourage them to apply for these areas. But I mean, if they choose not to, there's nothing that a local government can do. So we're sort of at their mercy as far as expanding service. And that goes back to what I talked about earlier. Mm-hmm. They want to expand service where it makes the most economic sense, and I understand that. But then if there's an area that doesn't make economic sense to expand into, but there's an area beyond that that has a number of households, they may choose not to do that. And so you can't provide that service out there to those folks, and it's just frustrating that you know, you're kind of at their mercy, and they're looking at it totally as they should from an economic standpoint, and all you can do is encourage them to expand as much as possible. But I mean, we don't have any leverage whatsoever. If you've not got a municipal utility or a electric system that's expanding it, you don't have any way to get this money and expand into these areas. That's the problem we're having.
Okay.
Other questions for Dr. Owen? Yes, Executive Huffman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Owen, so without going through all the numbers and the tables now, where would you say Tennessee stands relative to the states in the southeastern region in terms of available broadband that's affordable to folks with the median household income that's average?
So that's a very good question, especially on the affordability component. That I have less information about. I think it's that raw technical data that we have more information about when it comes to the rank. But so when it comes to, you know, what does that service at that speed tier cost households, and how does that compare to median household income or household budgets? That, unfortunately, I don't have information on.
Yeah, and that I suspect would be hard to get because you can have an area that's got a median household income of $32,000 versus a median household income of $95,000, and what's affordable in one area, that county is not affordable in the other area, and I don't know how you match that up. But I didn't know if Tennessee stood out as behind everyone else, in front of everyone else, or kind of in the middle. But
I haven't seen anything to suggest that we would be far off the norm from other states.
All right, thanks.
Any other questions? Dr. Owen, I have just a couple. One on page 2, and you're referencing your attachment B, you talk about state and federally funded grants totaling more than $565 million are leveraging an additional $351 million in grantee matching funds. Mm-hmm. Are local matches embedded in that additional $351 million?
So I think it depends on the program. I
Okay.
know for some of the federally funded grant programs, matching dollars from local governments can count toward the matching requirements for those federal grants. I think that's the case for the upcoming federal rounds as well. So that could vary. They could be in there, yes.
Okay, okay. I just know, like, with ECD, for instance, on the most recent round of grants, if local government did a match, and so Anderson County, for instance, we matched up to 500,000 for a couple of grant applications. But that would be good information for, I think, the legislature to know what local government is doing in terms of also expanding broadband.
I can follow up with ECD to see if they can break that out for us. The initial data that we have just had grantee matching dollars in it. It did not separate out what was a contribution from local governments. But I can follow up to see if they can.
That would
break
be
out.
wonderful.
Okay.
And then another question, you referenced that we're not tracking to see if the sales tax exemption, if those taking advantage of the exemption are using it to further, additional investment or an additional mile or whatever of broadband. Should we be tracking that? Would that be a recommendation that you would have?
We didn't really get to the point where we're making recommendations with this. I was just really to point out why I can't provide
Sure, okay.
the information that's there.
Gotcha, okay. And then, is there anything in that language, basically, if they have a sales tax exemption, is there a requirement that they use those materials in the state of Tennessee, or are they just afforded an exemption? For instance, if they wanted to source all materials in Tennessee, they're going to be a beneficiary of the sales tax exemption?
No, for details like that, I'd have to probably check back with the Department of Revenue to make sure that I fully understood that. I wouldn't want to lead you astray with my answer today.
Okay, thank you. Anything else for Dr. Owen? Thank you so much. An excellent report this morning.
Thank you, members.
Next, we have Dr. Michael Strickland on housing. Oh, I'm sorry, did I skip? I'm sorry, judicial redistricting, background and scenarios. Leah Eldridge and Bob Morio.
Proposals submitted by the Tennessee Trial Judges Association to the Advisory Task Force on the composition of judicial districts, which looked at judicial redistricting in Tennessee in 2018 and 19. He asked that the staff evaluate the proposals using two main criteria: access to justice and resource allocation. Today, I will briefly present some background information on the state's trial court system, including findings from past judicial redistricting studies in Tennessee and information on redistricting in other states. And then research manager Bob Morio will present his analysis of the three judicial redistricting proposals. There are currently 32 judicial districts in Tennessee, with each of these districts having circuit and chancery courts. Some districts have only one county in them, while others have multiple counties. There are also courts of limited jurisdiction at the local level. These include general sessions, juvenile, and municipal courts. And every court has a general sessions court. There have been several studies over the past 30 years looking at how judicial districts should be structured in Tennessee with varying recommendations. Some studies have recommended a more consolidated court system be implemented. For example, the Commission on the Future of the Tennessee Judicial System in 1996 recommended a substantial consolidation of all trial courts, reducing the then 31 judicial districts down to 8 to 12 districts and centralizing the record-keeping and administrative functions. In a 2004 Comptroller's report, the authors made a similar suggestion that the state legislature may want to consolidate all trial courts into one circuit court with divisions for different types of cases. Other courts did not recommend such sweeping changes. However, a 2003 study committee on judicial redistricting did not recommend any changes to the districts, but did call for a committee to convene regularly to examine the issues. A few years later, the Comptroller's Office hired the Justice Management Institute and the Center for Justice, Law, and Society at George Mason University to do a judicial redistricting study. In their 2009 report, the authors found that there was substantial opposition to redrawing district lines and did not recommend that redistricting occur at that time. In its 2019 report, the Advisory Task Force on the Composition of Judicial Districts found that the public was opposed to judicial district realignment. The only exception were the comments of people from Hickman, Lewis, and Perry counties in the 21st district that wanted to be separated from that district and form their own. The task force concluded that because of demographic changes, the 21st district should be realigned, and there was no need to realign the judicial districts anywhere else in Tennessee. They also recommended that there should be no reduction in the number of judges in Tennessee. In 2022, the General Assembly passed Public Chapter 1098 that requires the creation of an advisory task force by July 1st, 2025. The task force is directed to recommend and publish a proposed statewide redistricting plan and provides reasonable and timely access to Tennessee's courts and promotes the efficient utilization of publicly funded resources allocated for the courts by January 1st, 2027. We also looked at other states' redistricting efforts and found that they will make minor changes to their districts, but they don't often make major changes. Some states have permanent councils, commissions, or committees that look at the issue of judicial redistricting or apportionment of judges, and they have listed the information to be used when making these determinations in their statutes. The information they are required to consider includes such things as judicial weighted caseload studies, clerical weighted case workload studies, population, judicial districts, travel time in the district, uniformity in the calculation of how civil, criminal, and domestic cases are accounted for between districts, historical connections between counties, whether litigants have adequate access to the courts, and other information that the bodies deem relevant. As the laws from other states show, there are many types of information that can be considered when determining whether the number of judges should be changed or if judicial district boundaries or the number of judicial districts should be changed. Tennessee law requires the comptroller to annually update a judicial weighted caseload study that is to be used in determining the need for the creation or reallocation of judicial positions. However, the study has not been updated since fiscal year 2019 because of the effect of the pandemics on the court. And the judicial case weights used in the formula were last updated in 2013 by the National Center for State Courts. But the Comptroller's Office is set to release a report next month that will look at the past and future of weighted caseload studies in Tennessee. This concludes my portion of the presentation. I'd like to thank Jennifer Berry and Carly Van Sickle for helping to put this information together. And I will now cede the floor to Research Manager Bob Morio, who will present his analysis of the redistricting proposals.
Thank you.
Good morning, Commissioners. Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Madam Chair. So this was just a very simple statistical analysis to see what we could do with what was available. Since current county level weighted caseload data is unavailable, we looked back at the district level data from 2017 to 2019 to see if there were statistical relationships between the weighted caseloads, unweighted case filings, and population for the state's existing judicial districts. Once we determined that there were fairly strong correlations, we applied this analysis to the unweighted case filing and population data at the county level from 2020 to 2022 to estimate each proposed judicial district's share of the entire state's total judicial workload, and then how many of the 159 current judges should be allocated to each of the proposed districts. So in Table 1, those estimates are shown in the two leftmost columns under each proposal. And the next column shows how many existing judges would likely be assigned to each of those proposed districts, assuming that where an entire existing district is being incorporated into one of the proposed new districts, all of its current judges would get allocated to the proposed district. And then where existing districts are split up, its judges are only split if the estimated work share of the new district would require those additional judges. And the last column under each of those proposals in the table compares each district's share of judges based on workload to that probable number assigned and indicates the potential for an excess or deficit. Because all three of the options reduce the number of districts and assumingly a number of corresponding district attorneys, public defenders, they would likely reduce some administrative court costs somewhat statewide. They don't appear to have a measurable effect on reducing workloads, and because of the increased size of some of the districts, could possibly increase some travel requirements that make access to justice more difficult. And with that in mind, as well as looking at the 2009 Tennessee Judicial Redistricting Studies finding that workload equalization and access to courts can be achieved without redrawing district boundaries through the use of the weighted caseload methodology to allocate judicial resources. We used the same statistical analysis used in Table 1 to estimate share of judicial workload and an equivalent allocation of judges for Tennessee's 32 current judicial districts. And this is shown in Table 2. And the actual number of judges in 2023 is also shown along with the deficit or excess estimated in comparison to our calculated estimate. Again, these are just estimates that we could calculate using basic available data. Be happy to take any questions. I could certainly go into some more math if people are interested at 9:30 in the morning, but I don't think so. So,
Yes, Representative.
Thank you, Madam Chair Lady. I have a couple questions here. Senator Lundberg was unable to be here today because of commitments we had back in our district, but he has sent me a couple questions that I will relay to you and hopefully you can answer. Is there an ultimate recommendation that there should be some sort of redistricting? And the other is, out of the 20 annual weighted caseload reports, the only 2 reports TACIR used to get data are the only 2 out of the 20 that showed Shelby County needed more judges. All the others showed too many. One of the 2 was flawed because Shelby County didn't report data for that period. Those are the 2 questions he would like for me to ask. So,
well, I can perhaps give a bit of an answer for the second part, but the first one I might defer back to Leah for some more comment on the memo as a whole. But yeah, we attempted to just collect a small amount of data for today's meeting to see if there was a basic comparison that we could use, since there is not new caseload data at the county level, to be able to split that up into these, to take a look at the proposals that were put forward. So,
and I would add to that, part of that was we attempted to have the most current data that was available, keeping in mind changes that have been made since, with the creation of the 32nd district, for example. And even with the most current data, as Bob already mentioned, we had to make some statistical leaps to estimate the data, because the current data is just not available for weighted caseload analysis at the county level. And whenever you're talking about shifting districts, that's the standard of data you really need to make any type of recommendations or evaluations, which is why it's, I think, good that the comptroller's new report is coming out soon, and hopefully that will help with the current public chapter requiring analysis by 2025, or a task force by 2025, and analysis by 2027. But I think the concern with the older data was the older studies was availability of data, any data, and then the relevance of the data at this point, depending on how old the study was.
thank you. Back to the first question, you say Leah can answer that.
you want to, or?
We've only studied this for 3 weeks. I don't think that we're qualified to make a recommendation on whether or not it should be that redistricting should take place. Plus, the case-weighted studies, the case weights for judicial positions haven't been updated since 2013. The pandemic has happened since then. The case weights for the district attorneys and public defenders haven't been updated since 2006. And I think there were some issues with general sessions data. So I think if anyone was going to make a recommendation like that, they might want to consider getting the case-weighted studies updated for both the judicial positions and the district attorney and public defender positions, if good general sessions data is available, and then to take it from there.
I think that's what he was looking for is maybe that we, before we make any decisions, that we have the most proper data that we can have. So, thank you.
Other questions? Yes, Senator Campbell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. What was the reference to the 21st that you felt? I didn't catch all of that. When you were first talking, you were saying that seemed that you didn't see a need for changes in any judicial district but the 21st?
The 2019 task force did.
Ah.
They ended up forming a 32nd judicial district with those 3 counties.
Okay.
In 2022, I believe, so.
Can you just tell me, what are the rules around redistricting in these districts? Do they have to be sequential? Is it all just discretionary?
We've only studied this a few weeks. I'm just going to have to beg off on that question. We haven't dug that deep into it.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions? Yes, Dr. Lippert.
And I agree with Leah's response to that. I will say that the most recent, the trial judges, their task force study mentioned geographic sequential or location as one of the factors that should be considered. It didn't say that it was a requirement, but it was one of the factors that they said should be considered.
Any other questions? All right, thank you so much for the presentation. Next, Dr. Strickland with the Housing Affordability, Impact Fees, and Development Taxes Draft Report.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning, Commissioners. This is, as just noted, the draft report on housing affordability, which you will find behind tab 9 of your docket books, and which is being submitted for your review and comment. This report was prepared in response to House Joint Resolution 139 by Representative Sparks, introduced last year, which requested the Commission study the factors affecting housing affordability in the state. The final report is to be presented at the next Commission meeting. As the Commission has heard now at the last 2 meetings, including from 2 panels in September, housing affordability has become a pressing issue for many Tennesseans, and one that is shaped by a variety of different factors. One factor that has been suggested, for example, is impact fees, but while impact fees do add to the baseline cost of a new home, they also help pay for infrastructure improvements, add to the property value, and when they are used, may have only a limited effect on housing costs. One survey by the National Association of Home Builders estimated that just under a quarter of the cost of a home could be attributed to government regulations. But just to clarify, that was not specific to impact fees and was counting regulations in general, including building codes, labor safety requirements, etc. It should also be noted that the estimate came from a national survey and Tennessee-specific data is not available. But in any case, no one regulatory factor alone appears to account for more than a few percentage points of the cost of a house. If there is any one factor that stands out, and where there's broad agreement among researchers and stakeholders, it's undersupply. Housing affordability has suffered because the number of homes is simply not enough to meet the demand. Fortunately, the state already has a number of programs in place to help with housing affordability, while local governments are equipped with many policy tools to improve housing supply and, through that, affordability. There are, however, some additional ways that the state could help local governments meet their housing needs, while also leaving them the flexibility to find strategies that make the most sense for their own local conditions. In part, this may mean reforms to zoning regulations to allow more housing to be built. A number of other states have recently tried to reform zoning at the local level through statewide preemptions, but given the wide variation among Tennessee local communities and their housing needs, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. Thus, a voluntary and incentives-based approach to zoning reform could help local governments in adopting reforms that would increase their housing supplies while still leaving them with discretion over their own land use. Based on these and other findings, the draft report makes 6 recommendations, 2 of which the Commission has made previously in related studies. First, for the 2 recommendations that the Commission has made before, as noted in a 2012 Commission report on dealing with blight, more local governments could benefit from having the ability to create land banks. However, at present, only a small number of cities and counties are allowed to create them, and so the Commission recommends that the General Assembly authorize all local governments to establish land banks. Second, the state and many local governments also possess their own property that could be made available for housing. The Department of General Services currently collects information on state-owned real property, but greater coordination among information sources would be beneficial, and local governments could reach a wider audience by having their own property information listed on DGS's website. As it did before in 2019, the Commission recommends that the state help local governments reach a wider audience of potential buyers for their surplus real properties by allowing those that have websites to post links to the state's website where the state advertises its own surplus real property. Next, the Commission finds that zoning reform can help affordability by increasing the housing supply, and it is something already within the power of local governments to do. But local officials may be reluctant to adopt unfamiliar zoning changes and rightly point out that new development comes with upfront costs. While some residents might also have concerns about increased traffic and noise with greater density, changes in the character of their communities, or higher property tax bills as nearby areas become more developed. For these reasons, the Commission makes 2 related recommendations. One, that the state offer an incentive for local governments to adopt zoning reforms that support housing development by sharing some of the state's realty transfer tax or mortgage tax revenue with local governments whose land use regulations meet a minimum number of criteria out of a menu of optional measures. And for that, I would direct your attention to Table 2 in the draft report on page 12. That shows you just an example scenario of how some of these revenues could be allocated for several of the recommendations that we're making here. And the percentages there are certainly open to discussion. I'd also emphasize that this is considering only the portion of the revenue that's currently unearmarked. And has been noted recently, of course, the state's overall tax revenues have not risen so far this fiscal year, so the portion of the realty transfer tax or mortgage tax revenue that is used could be phased in as state revenue growth allows. Along with this incentive for zoning reforms to support housing supply and to also address concerns about density's effects on property taxes, the Commission recommends that the effects of zoning reform on existing residents be mitigated by assessing property based on its zoning prior to reform, similar to the way Tennessee's current Greenbelt law bases property tax assessment on the land's actual use rather than its highest and best use. If developers were to then later take advantage of the reformed zoning to add more housing and improvements to a property, a rollback provision could ensure that some of the amount of taxes saved could be recaptured by local governments. There are 2 other ways that the state might make use of the realty transfer and mortgage tax revenue to support housing. One is that THDA, the Tennessee Housing Development Agency, among its range of programs, currently operates a trust fund of its own, but that fund receives no state appropriations and operates only on revenues from THDA's mortgage loan program. Therefore, the Commission recommends another possible use of the realty transfer and mortgage tax revenues would be to fund either the existing housing trust fund or a new one from which THDA might make low or zero interest construction loans for affordable housing. The construction industry, though, is also vulnerable to swings in the economy, as was seen during the Great Recession. So to soften the effects of downturns and forestall the loss of construction employment, the Commission recommends that funding from the realty transfer and mortgage taxes could also be reserved by the state for infrastructure in ways that smooth out the ups and downs of the business cycle. Lastly, the Commission makes one related finding that the state could authorize local governments to make multi-year funding commitments to affordable housing projects either through existing entities such as industrial development boards or by establishing a new entity similar to sports authorities. This finding draws on an example from Charlotte, North Carolina, where the city's housing trust fund is being used to help developers buy, rehabilitate, and preserve existing affordable housing. That fund relies on general obligation bonds, though, so local governments in Tennessee cannot copy its exact funding structure. And under the Tennessee State Constitution and state law, cities and counties are generally limited in their authority to provide direct funding to private enterprises. But that concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you. Questions? Commissioner?
Yeah, just one quick question. So since your funding draws from North Carolina, but you note that there's obviously Tennessee can't mimic that structure because of some laws. Just curious, in your research, did you find another example from a city or municipality that is closer aligned to perhaps what Tennessee could adopt?
Not yet. So the program that started in North Carolina, I believe, started just last year. It's very new, but has started to garner some attention from stakeholders in Tennessee. So that's why we want to bring it to your attention. It's unclear how best it could be translated to Tennessee, but it is something that is just perhaps worth monitoring as it goes forward. But certainly, to adapt it here, it might require some action by the General Assembly. So.
Thank you, Commissioner. Other questions? Yes, Mr. Peach.
I guess it's kind of more of a statement, but it looks like the North Carolina issue makes more sense than a lot of the recommendations that I see, just because to me it's just kind of elementary that those that are building the houses are the ones that need to be assisted or receiving funds as an incentive to build those houses. I see the land banks. I feel like Tennessee's already has the ability with PRDs and PUDs. We have the ability to zone for these types of things as it is, but I just would like to see it explore the North Carolina issue a lot better, because I think the only way that you're going to have affordable housing is to cut those costs for those that are building it, and so just consider that in your.
Other questions? Mayor Waters.
The data that on it's one of the appendix.
Yes.
Which one is it? Anyway, it's the one that talks about the median price of homes,
Yes.
then the ratio, and then home ownership rate, and then the vacancy rate.
Yes.
Is that saying that there's, and I'm looking at Sevier County in particularly, that there's a 33% vacancy rate in the homes? Because we just recently completed a housing study, and our vacancy rate is like 1%.
Yep.
There's no available homes, and we've got a task force actually that's working on steps we can take to encourage the building of homes and affordable homes and apartments and duplexes and all this. And zoning certainly is one part of that, but then we're looking at trying to provide infrastructure in some manner to encourage private development, to keep costs down and figure out all that. But I just wonder where that vacancy rate came
Yes.
from.
So certainly I thought you might ask about that. So that data, most of the data in that table is coming from the Census Bureau, specifically the ACS 5-year estimates, and the most recent ones that were released just last month. So because that's very new data, we didn't have quite enough time to fully parse that out. There is more to it that we'll be adding in the final draft. But for that specifically, what they are doing, that's the sort of top line vacancy number. There are other vacancy measures that sort of are a breakdown of that. So that top line number just looks at the total number of housing units in a county, and then how many are unoccupied at a given time. But that could be for many different reasons. In some counties, it'll be because you have a lot of abandoned homes that are in disrepair. In other places, particularly like Sevier County, it's a lot of vacation homes and short-term rentals. But when you break...
So those vacation homes and short-term rentals would be, if they're not permanent housing, would be considered part of the vacancy rate?
for this top line number. They do, however, provide other data. One in particular, the what they call the homeowner vacancy rate, which for Sevier County is, I believe, 1.2%. So that's a signal that there's very few homes that are available for sale, open for would-be home buyers.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense if they're considering that. I mean, we've got like 14,000 rental cabins in Sevier County. If those are considered in that vacancy rate, then that number makes sense. It just didn't, because we just completed a housing study, and our vacancy rate was about 1% in the county. But if that vacancy rate includes the overnight rentals, well, then it makes sense. Thank you.
And as Mike said, that this is one of those things where we will dig into deeper, and I think this is a good observation, we should include both those numbers in the final report, and I'm sure the team will be able to do that.
Senator Yarborough.
Thank you. Excellent report. Appreciate the work. Walk me through a little bit. You make a recommendation regarding how the state could incentivize certain zoning forms to improve housing supply, and there's a tax proposed for utilization there. Are there restrictions currently on how that's used, like in terms of within the current statutory code, and like what do you think would be, how would that actually function in practice?
Well, so for the two recordation taxes there, the revenue or the realty transfer tax and the mortgage tax, most of that is unearmarked. There are a few for the realty transfer tax that is 37 cents on every $100 of the realty transfer. 8 of those 37 cents are currently earmarked. For the mortgage tax, I believe that's 11.5 cents. I don't believe any of that is currently earmarked. So most of it is unearmarked. It just goes into the general fund. There have been a few items in recent budgets, I believe, that have used some of that, but most of it is unearmarked.
And have other states utilized that methodology like this in terms of?
Not exactly like this one. There are a few that have tried sort of incentive-based approaches. This is all very new, though. There's been a lot of legislative activity on this in other states just in the past few years, but all of these programs are quite new. So Indiana, I believe, has done a program where they're offering some funding for local governments if they adopt some changes. New York is offering some preference in grant funding applications to local governments that increase their permitting. So there have been a few attempts like that, but not exactly like this one.
Well, no, I appreciate this in the report because, I mean, the legislative efforts that I'm aware of really are much more in the form of mandates on local government, and I really appreciate, which, I mean, obviously, both the members of this commission and the members of the legislature can bristle at certain of those things. So I really appreciate this work. It's very important. Thank you.
And just to riff off of that, just a little bit, the menu-based approach that this is kind of based off is based as a starting point on the Montana example that a lot of people have read about, where Montana gave a list of options that local governments could adopt from, but they mandated that they had to choose a certain number of those items, and we decided that an incentive approach was more appropriate for Tennessee.
Mayor Brown.
Thank you. I think the most compelling thing I saw in your report was that increasing the supply even at higher cost helps affordability for all. And it makes sense, but I really hadn't thought of it in that way, so I appreciate that. The thing that, and I like the incentive approach as well, as they were talking about in the menu of choices that one may have to get more affordable housing in your community. But the concern I have is that in some parts of the state, we have a very strong anti-growth sentiment. And I feel like, one, they would not incentivize, and two, impact fees could be utilized to a level at which it would impact the ability to build homes that work as you say they should if you're in a reasonable circumstance. So I think more a comment than a question. I don't know what you do with that, but that's the thing that I keep wrestling about and seeing so much in Middle Tennessee, because there are people whose sole mission is to stop any growth at the same time we need workforce, and at the same time that we have, so many residents who can't afford homes.
Other questions? Yes, Senator Campbell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So did you look at all at the out-of-state people purchasing land here, and if there are any effective mechanisms? I mean, that might just be a constitutional issue and it might be impossible, but I mean, one thing that we have going on here in Nashville is a lot of people have bought up properties and are STR properties that, take them out of the market and reduce inventory significantly. I saw a map of it. It was very alarming to see how many of them were out-of-state owners who are profiting off of being able to rent these properties out. So I don't know if that even came into your consideration, or if that's just literally something that we can't address.
I'm not aware of any particular mechanism that could address that, but certainly the effect of greater population moving into the state is something that many of the stakeholders we talked to raised. The way that has shaped out in the past few years has been fluctuating. It's very difficult to see where exactly that effect is hitting in different parts of the state, but certainly that is something that many people cited as they felt a cost driver of house price appreciation in their communities.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I mean, can you have out-of-state tax differential disincentives or anything like that? Is it?
I'm not.
Sorry.
No? You can't? I don't think so. Okay. All right, thank you.
Yes, Commissioner.
Just one quick question. As we obviously see in the report, the demand for more housing and land availability, and if not in this report, is it something that was considered, the loss of farmland and how agricultural land availability sort of fits into this? Just curious if that was something that was looked at.
Somewhat tangentially, certainly we did talk to a few researchers, including one at UT, who is looking at that very specific issue. It's certainly been on the minds of some stakeholders, this concern about developments into greenfield areas, taking over farmland. So part of some of the advocates behind zoning reform are interested in seeing infill development that might then sort of divert some of that development further in towards urban areas and spare some of that farmland. So there is some intersection there between those concerns, yes.
Other questions? Yes, Mayor.
Thank you. Something that Senator Campbell said made me think of this, and I don't remember if the discussion was here or elsewhere, but there have been conversations about how property tax is assessed. I was kind of thinking about it when you were talking about comparing to the Greenbelt zoning, where you would go back and reclaim taxes over a period of years. But I think there is a disconnect across the state about how properties are assessed. And so when you have an investor that owns multiple properties within a community, they should be assessed at a commercial level because those are income properties for them. But determining what those income properties are has become a challenge for those who are the property assessors. And so I don't know if there's some solution there that can help disincentivize, make sure that they're charged at a commercial level, but also create a revenue stream for local governments that doesn't currently exist. Because I even know local people who own multiple properties, and they get some assessed at a commercial zoning and some assessed at a typical resident zoning, even though they both are in residential zones, but say they own duplexes or something like that. So
Well, certainly, we did speak to some assessors, and they brought up that very same problem. Right now, it's very difficult. There isn't really any one comprehensive source of data on those large institutional investors who are buying homes, so it's not always easy for the assessors to identify which homes are owned in effect by a larger entity and should be charged at that or assessed at that commercial rate. So it's certainly a problem that they raised. As yet, there doesn't really seem to be a straightforward solution to that, though. Afraid.
Other questions? I have a couple, Dr. Strickland. You referenced in your introductory remarks the cost of local regulation being approximately 25%, but you noted that that was a national number, not really specific to Tennessee. Did that data point or that statement make it into the report? I mean, I read your report, I just didn't recall it being in there. So it is in there? Okay. I guess one of the things I want to ask about that is, does that number take into account some, I know other panels that we've had on other issues such as right-of-way reservation and the cost, is that incorporated into that number, that 25% number?
Yes.
Okay.
So that, specifically that number was 23.8%. There were several sort of breakdowns of that. The largest category, I believe, was changes in building codes, which amount to 6.1%. So all the other categories, you're looking at around 2-3%. Some of those, for instance, yes, right-of-way dedications, that sort of thing.
Okay. And I guess, and I should know this, so I'm going to confess my ignorance. I don't. In the state of Tennessee, do we have limits on the cost of local permits? Like, is there a, so for instance, in the state of Florida, there has to be, you can, from a permitting standpoint, you can only charge as a local government exactly what it costs to do the plans review. You can't use your permits and fee process as, its own impact fee of sorts. Do we have those limitations in the state of Tennessee?
I'm not aware of anything in statute about permitting per se. There are certainly limitations when it comes to impact fees.
Okay.
But not anything on permitting that I'm aware of.
Okay. That might be something to look at, especially I know in your report you had something in there about the time it takes for plan review oftentimes can be a detriment to development, in a particular community. So if it takes a long time, developers are just going to kind of give up. And the other thing, I guess, just two other quick points. You did reference in there the manufactured homes, but I'm wondering if, I'm just going to use an example on Instagram because we're covering this topic. There are all these container homes, shipping container homes. That's become big business, and people are doing a lot of, really cool design with those. And so I hit follow just because it's relevant to our board here. Well, now I'm being marketed as, for investing in all of these companies that are addressing what we're talking about here, which is cost of regulation, lack of construction employees, all of these things. There are a lot of groups out there, and I'm getting all of that on my feed. So, maybe there are some of those groups that are looking from a investor standpoint, they've looked at the data in the state of Tennessee or in the Southeast, and they're saying, here are the issues, here are our financial findings, and here's what we're going to develop in response. So I just thought I would throw that out there as something maybe to look at. I know I've mentioned this before, we have Clayton in Tennessee. It'd be interesting to see if they would share, what they're looking at and how they've managed to address cost or affordability based on their own findings. And then lastly, you mentioned homelessness in Tennessee, but one of the things I'm going to mention this just because the mayors continue to talk about this is it would be nice to have a little bit of a data point in there so that the legislature would understand we're all seeing an explosion of campers in our community to deal with the housing issue, and there's really not a lot of regulation around it, and we've spoken with TDEC. There's been a lot of conversations locally. I know, at least from our standpoint, Mayor Waters in East Tennessee, pretty much every county is wrestling with it. So that might be something to include just so that the legislature is aware of what we're seeing at a local basis. Yes, Senator Campbell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry to talk twice. I appreciate it. I mean, one thing I just wanted to add to what I was asking is, a lot of times, and this doesn't actually have to pertain to just out-of-state people, the income differential and the risk differential that people have because of that puts our market sometimes at a disadvantage because it makes sense for investors to buy up a bunch of property and sit on it. And that puts us in a situation where to have an actual fair competitive market, and this actually does, I think, filter down into our homeless situation, to have a fair competitive market advantage, the decks are stacked against us. So, I mean, it wouldn't even have to be relative to out-of-state investors. It could be just a number at which you're saying, and I really appreciated your comments, because it would be a number at which you would say maybe this has to be a commercial operation if you're owning and renting X number of properties or something like that. I mean, I don't know, but we need solutions like that, whatever that may be, yesterday. So I just thought I'd point out that there are people coming in here buying up properties and sitting on them, and it's a problem.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Peach.
One more, just real quick, just to follow up on what Mayor Frank was talking about with the 25%. Did you notice in your study the actual impact fees? Did you find any that were over 1% of the price of the home? We hear a lot about impact fees, but what I've noticed is usually it's 1% or less of the cost of the home. So I didn't know what you found in your research.
Yes, going by the most recent data from 2022, the median home price in the state would be $408,000 at the time. So looking at the impact fees that are charged in most areas, that would come out to, 1%, maybe a little more, maybe a little less.
Sure, depending on where you're at. Thanks.
Any other questions? Thank you so much, Dr. Strickland.
Sorry. Thank you.
That is all we have this morning. Dr. Lippard?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, the only other business is selection of our next meeting date. We found, especially this far out, it's probably best to poll the members, but just to give you an idea, our next meeting will be in the June timeframe, well, after the end of the legislative session, because one of the main things we do at that meeting, of course, is adopt new items that are referred to us into the work program. So we will be reaching out to the members. And then we'll also be reaching out to you regarding the technology initiative I mentioned yesterday, where we're going to look at transitioning from the paper docket books to an electronic means. And talking to some of the members after the meeting yesterday, we'll probably also find out what the preferences of the members, how many members would want to use their own electronic laptop or tablet, how many would want us to provide a tablet just for review during the meeting? And I'm sure there might be one or two who will want to continue to receive paper copies, and we'll also make that an option. So that's all I have, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you. Anything else? All right, unless there is an objection, we will stand adjourned. Hearing none, we are adjourned.